So, guys, on November 20th, the Professional Fighters League dropped the bombshell that most of us expected when they acquired Bellator MMA. Though we weren't flooded with details, we got a few bullet points. In 2024, PFL will launch Bellator International Championship Series. That will consist of 8 events, they told us. The PFL champions versus the Bellator champions will take place in 2024. A few champions even already faced off at the finale that they had in November. And lastly, they laid claim to the fact that PFL and Bellator combined, their roster is equal to the UFC's, each holding 30% of the top 25 talent. All right, guys, what was your general reaction to this huge news? Will this be the industry shifting move PFL hopes it will be? Nolan, you get the first take this week.
Yeah, I think it's there's going to be a lot that has to happen before we start making those sort of claims that PFL's vision for this thing is going to come to fruition, right? It's one of the most interesting times in the industry for good and bad. I think getting rid of one of the three premier organizations, one of the three options that fighters have, essentially, is going to hurt a lot of free agents. It's not good for the sport as a whole in terms of the fighters' business side. Um, but at the same time, I do think that as a fan and as a fighter, um, and for PFL, if you're in the brass, it is an interesting time in this industry, to have kind of a major player like this emerge, or two major players form into one. This is a massive deal in terms of a number of different things, right? I think that the UFC has always had, or for a long time has had, the best talent pool. I still think that's the case. I don't think they have anything to worry about in that regard. But to have a very, very, very strong number two like this with such a deep talent pool is going to make for some interest. I think it's what PFL and Bellator needed, was something to really energize their brands, and coming together has done that. I mean, all of a sudden now people are talking about these PFL versus Bellator fights. Like, Bellator was putting on great fights, I think, for the last 2 years in terms of merit-based matchups, doing a really good job of building some young talent and developing them into champions or contenders. And it was like nobody really, it was hard to get people to care. A lot of people felt like they couldn't watch it. They didn't know where to watch it. They didn't want to pay for showtime. So to have people talking about these fights again, that's a huge thumbs up for Bellator. And then for PFL, I think there's a certain amount of credibility that comes from them coming from a promotion that really seemed like it was on the ropes to, somehow ending up on ESPN, doing something different with the tournament style. And now they all of a sudden have built themselves to be, what Don Davis and Peter Murray and everybody have been saying for a while, which is, to be that definitive number two. I remember when they first said that, there was a lot of people, even on the Bellator side behind the scenes and stuff, that kind of scoffed at that. And it did feel at the time, even from our position, the PFL was almost trying to use Bellator's name in a similar way that Bellator tries to use the UFC's name to kind of prop themselves up. But here we are, and they're the definitive number two. This year is going to be very interesting. How do they delegate their resources? What kind of fights are we putting on? Are these pay-per-views going to be, when you look at it, you're going to say, you know what, I will show up 50, 60 bucks for that. That's a really good card. That all has to remain to be seen. So there's a lot that needs to happen before we even start talking about them being in a competition with the UFC, a true like neck and neck competition with the UFC in terms of their brands. I don't think it'll ever happen, but it'll be interesting as a case study to see what happens when a strong number two like this comes together.
Mm-hmm. All right, Goes. You've seen quite a few mergers over your lifetime. What did you think of this one? Did it wow you? Even though we were kind of expecting you, did it still kind of blow you away when it finally happened?
Well, I feel like some of the other ones that you're mentioning, particularly the Strikeforce one, they felt like they happened overnight. And with this one, it just went on for so long that I think we all kind of had an idea we were going in that direction. But at the end of the day, it's a huge step forward in the sense that you're solidifying your company as a proper number two, right? If you're expecting Pride versus the UFC, where Pride had a way better roster in certain divisions, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're pretty far from something like that. But where I do think they will have an effect is, like Nolan said, I think your C and B level fighters, they just have less options. That's going to be a little bit difficult on them. But your A level talent, I think that's where we're going to see a big mark, especially in the way that the UFC can leverage their negotiation tactics against these guys. Because Now they do have that other option, right? If you're a high level UFC athlete, you can go over to the PFL and possibly try and make that $1 million or get something, maybe not to the extent of what Francis Ngannou got, right? But how about just the ability, the flexibility of PFL and letting an athlete go box or let them do something else? I think there's something to be said in that. And I think that will probably change the way the UFC has to negotiate with some of these athletes. It won't be so much our way or the highway, because it's kind of proven that you can leave the UFC and do something else and make a good paycheck. So I think it'll have those types of effects. But overall, the product, I feel like maybe the decision to buy them and get that over with, that was the most important thing. And I'm not so sure they have all the answers that they want as far as what they're going to do moving forward, because there's so many options, so many fighters, seasons versus Grand Prix, all that stuff. Do you want to just do it all together? So many questions. But I mean, the only ones that are going to end up winning in this situation are the fans, right? The fans are going to love whatever comes out of this, because the amount of talent that they have together will make for a lot of fun matchups.
All right. Of course, we go to Mike Bond in Toronto. Same as goes. You've covered a few of these now. What were your thoughts, man, of PFL acquiring Bellator and its roster?
Well, it is interesting, right? Because I think last year we had on the same podcast, kind of wrapping up the year, one of the things was like, who is the number 2 in the industry? And I think I had said that PFL had kind of stepped into that spot, and I thought they had established themselves as the number 2. And I think that got a few people at Bellator a bit upset, but it's just kind of the way I saw it unfold over the course of the year. So I guess this is kind of a gradual step forward for them to make a big acquisition like this and try to take their company to the next level. So this is a huge deal in terms of where they're trying to be that co-leader in the industry. I think, Nolan laid it out pretty well, how many challenges still come in terms of doing that. But clearly there's dedication, there's resources, them aligning with the people and the money involved in Saudi Arabia as well is obviously a huge thing in terms of their flexibility and trying to make stuff happen. And yeah, I guess it just depends like on how are they really going to unfold this and how much are they going to follow through in terms of these plans. Like you go to these PFL events and they have the signage up being like PFL Europe, PFL Africa, PFL Asia. Like in some sense, if they can execute that, that could be great for the industry, right? Like you can get some of these fighters in Europe who struggle to get more than a couple fights a year when Bellator like pops over there and puts 20 fights on a card in Ireland or whatever. Like maybe there's going to be more consistency for that. And same goes if they do move into Africa and Asia and things like that. So there is a potential for this to be a good thing, even from like more of a grassroots level of the sport. But when you talk about their biggest shows, they're going to be trying to do these pay-per-views. That's where the real challenge is going to come in, because you would imagine that's where they're hoping for the biggest return on investment, and they're going to put their biggest names and all that. So it's tricky, like to maximize this platform. Will their season model continue to work, like where you can't necessarily do selective matchmaking and you never know who's going to come through that? Your biggest paid guys or biggest name guys can lose in the first round, as we've seen many times throughout this tournament and season format. So how does that work in terms of like building stars and trying to manage the roster and put together the biggest fights? So they have some decisions to make, but they have seemingly the resources. They have now the assets. And now they have an ESPN deal again. So there's some security there as well. So obviously this is been a fantastic year if you're on the PFL side, not so much if you're on the Bellator side, because that brand just seems like it's on life support a little bit at this point. Like, is this going to exist beyond 2024 with the Bellator attachment? Or are they just trying to figure out their obligations for television and kind of move on at that point, and we'll all become PFL? So there's a lot of evolving stuff here, but they put themselves in a great spot and put their money where their mouth is literally at this point.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I want to go in reverse order here for a couple follow-ups I have for you guys. As a fan, which you are, and as someone that's covered the sport for such a long time, do you think Bellator and PFL can put cards together that would get you more pumped up over some UFC fight nights? We just kind of look at them and go, what? And that's just not us. It's the fans. I mean, sometimes we skip them or whatever. Do you think that's where maybe Bellator and PFL going forward can find their sweet spot?
You can just call it PFL-ator. I'm
PFL-ator.
still taking credit for coining that one. But yeah, like sure they could, but is that even a fair question? Like, could PFL's best card be better than a low quality fight night at the Apex? Like, yeah, obviously they could do that, but can they do that consistently every weekend, every couple months, once a quarter? Like, that's where the challenge comes in, right? Like, obviously PFL has the roster to do a great card, but can they do 6 great cards a year or more? That's where the biggest challenge comes in.
Yeah.
And
Chat room,
not to go out of order here.
Yeah, go ahead, Nolan.
No, I was going to say, not to go out of order. I don't know what you guys feel, but to Mike's point too, I think the fact that there is the structure right now is still really weird coming into this year. Like, I'm not even talking about just the Bellator brand. You know, when Don Davis made this announcement, he had 5 different, he's like, here's our 5 different fight series that will be under the PFL umbrella. So I think a big part of it is like for fans, like the storylines and getting hooked on it. And I think the season differentiated them from the rest of the pack. It was a good way to stick out when Bellator existed. But I almost wonder if it does hurt that sort of aspect where the fans start to really get involved and care about the fighters and care about their journeys when you throw them in that tournament. So I don't know what you guys feel like, but I wouldn't even be mad if necessarily they scrapped the tournament come 2025.
Mm-hmm.
I think they'll have to go that direction. I think that's inevitable. I think that's where it's going to go, right? Like, I don't think this season format is necessarily sustainable for the long term when you're just trying to put together the biggest fights and trying to make, you know, these cards big and these, you know, pay-per-views now that they're going to have to be selling. It's just tricky. Maybe they go in a different way and have, like, you know, some of their their lower tier talent do the tournaments and then just have everyone else in kind of one-offs. But
let that be their Dana White Contender Series version.
Yeah,
you guys do this on the side and the big names do the Arena Series.
I mean, that sounds great, but are you willing to pay $7 million annually, $1 million per weight class for that? That seems like
no, we'd have to cut down on the amount of M's they dole out for sure.
Yeah.
But
and then that takes away the value of the whole thing and one of the key selling points, right? That you can be this person and come over here and win this tournament and get $1 million and change your life. And, you know, maybe you went 2-5 or 3-6 in the UFC, but that doesn't preclude you from doing this, which is great for the athletes and for the sport and all that stuff. But again, if we're talking about the promotion, the business side, is that sustainable? Is that something you can build a long-term successful brand off of? And that's, I think, going to be the biggest question, is the allocation of the resources here and what they're going to do with it. Because at some point, we've seen it so many times, no matter how much Saudi money you have, the investments, this, that, and the other thing, at some point, people get fed up with just, you know, losing money on every single event and coming out, you know, under the money line every single year. So at some point it's going to have to turn profitable, you would imagine, in some degree.
I'm curious to see, I think Mike might have brought it up, but the matchmaking and which direction they go with that. Because if you guys remember when the WEC came over, when those guys came over, for a long time, it felt like you had the WEC 155ers and the UFC 155ers. And it was a division. We interviewed a lot of them and they felt like we still feel like we're representing the WEC. They didn't take us serious. And if you're going to do champion versus champion, well, then you're going to get a lot of answers there right away, right? But if Bellator comes in and mops the floor with PFL talent, going forward, how are they gonna match make that? You know, do they want to put favorable matchups towards some of the PFL guys to kind of get a little face back? I don't know. I think that's going to be kind of interesting going forward to see how they actually match make.
Is that what you're most fired up about, Goes? Is those face-offs? They had a couple of them. They had Magomed Karamov versus Jason Jackson, and I believe they had Patricio Pitbull Frady versus Jesus Pinedo, where you kind of already thinking that's going to be a good way to ignite these things, you know, ignite 2024.
It's weird because, you know, like that is fun, obviously, right? When you saw Pitbull and Pinedo, you think that's a great matchup, but it doesn't always work out that way, right? If you're gonna put Cyborg and Pacheco, well, aren't we all kind of be wishing that was Kayla Harrison? So I don't know. It can kind of go both ways, but I like the fact that they did it. I thought it kind of set the foundation for the future, got people something to talk about, and that's what they need.
Nolan, you've sat cage side for a lot of Bellator events, so you know a lot of the organization. And Scott Coker's not going to come over. The president of Bellator is not going to come over, but Mike Hogan is their matchmaker. What are your thoughts on him? It seems like a lot of fighters have positive things to say about him, but are you a fan of his style of matchmaking? And Do you think he'll be well received at PFL? Excuse me, PFLator, and that's Mike Bonds. Everybody, I'm seeing the chat light up with that. I've heard other shows light up with that, but I'm pretty damn sure Mike Bond coined it. So give him his due.
Yeah, we gotta Bond. You gotta trademark that or something. But in terms of Mike Hogan, man, I definitely think he was very popular among the fighters. You know, you saw when the merger happened, a lot of fighters came out and in their kind of reactions to the merger, they mentioned him and they hoped that he came over. And it wasn't just, you know, I think sometimes people see tweets from certain managers and stuff and they think like, oh, this manager's, you know, spamming something like that on all his clients' pages. And that may be true. But I did notice, it seemed to me that there was a large deviation in, there was a lot of diversity when it came to which fighters were saying that, right? We had like the Pitbull brothers were saying it. We had a number of the different Russian fighters were saying it. I saw Logan Storley come out and say it. I saw Patchy Mix say it. So there was a number of different fighters from all different walks of life, different management groups, whatever, that definitely said that. And a lot of the people I talked to behind the scenes on the management side also were hopeful that he would come over, not just because of their dealings with him in Bellator, but they also felt like that sometimes their interactions with PFL historically haven't been the best. They haven't necessarily had that sort of MMA rapport that they've, you know, sometimes I've kind of gotten the feeling from, and it's been explicitly said to me that sometimes they feel like they're kind of a cog in the machine. They're just kind of a number. Sometimes it's hard to get in touch with people. So that's not everybody at PFL, but there are certain people that I know managers deal with that's the way they feel. So to have somebody that does have that table side manner in terms of the negotiating table, I do think that the fighters seem to be very happy with it, which is a big part of the big picture, right? In terms of his matchmaking, talent development, stuff like that, I think you kind of saw him take the reins a little bit more in the last year or two of Bellator in terms of putting together matchups that test the prospects, which I kind of like. I think he's done a good job of going out there and maybe getting those free agents at the UFC, not necessarily prospects, but I'm talking like free agents the UFC might not look at that are in Russia, you know, guys like Tafik, guys like Alexander Shabli. You know, he's fluent in Russian, so he's got a very good connection with that part of the world. You know, Mansoor Barnawai he was out in Korea, you know, for a while there competing kind of underrated, under the radar. So those are the kind of things that he was responsible for there. I think Coker was more of kind of like the big picture, you know, getting the Musasis and the Fedors and kind of seeing what they want to do and making them happy and some of the bigger stuff. So to kind of just put in perspective for people, that was kind of his role, was doing maybe those more nitty gritty, making your lineup sort of deeper things for Bellator.